Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome. What's today's themes? Well, we've got three: ethics, inclusiveness, and ideas. And I think what's interesting about those is that they are all very different, but in a way, they're very similar. So, who's on the panel today? I've got Darshita Gillies, who's the founder and CEO of Manch, Claire Mason, the Chief Executive Officer of Man Bites Dog, Jeremy Beard, the Managing Partner of Hayes McIntyre. I think we all know him. And of course, Francesca Lagerberg, our anchor tenant on our 39th episode. She, of course, has been with us for all 38 of them. And finally, and of course, yours truly, Richard Chapman, the founder and chief exec of the Forum. So that's your today's panel. Before we move on to the actual detail of today, what are the 7 strategies for retuning your firm? And the first one I would say is you've got to think big. You've got to believe 6 impossible things before breakfast. Next, think small. Focus on some of those angles that resonate with your key audiences. Third, remember that you are the power of your relationships, and that means you've got to reciprocate favors. Do a campaign, not a one-off, because that really converts an audience into a community. Drop the convention, go for new ideas and new services, because at the end of the day, you have to do things differently. And remember that speed is of the essence. What you've got to do is you've got to articulate, you've got to actually market test your assumptions, be clear what it is you're actually doing. We'll be hearing from Claire later about projects and how important assumptions are if you've got to actually invest in a project. And if those assumptions prove invalid, and they will, then you need to amend them and pivot in a new direction. And you've got to be entrepreneurial. You've got to keep listening and innovating. And the key word in that sentence is actually listening. Because if you're not listening to your clients, you have a problem. If you're not listening to your people, you have a problem. So be entrepreneurial and keep listening. So there's some 7 strategies. And I would like to thank Elena Gutsko of Globsec in Bratislava, speaking at the Global Think Tank back in April 2020. Really great strategies. So what's happening now? Well, we wanted to really sort of talk about the forum, and there's a couple of events coming up, Drivers for Change, and Fast Track Innovation. Fast Track Innovation is very interesting, 17th of March, and we're really looking at how we can actually help firms address business challenges through design thinking and design sprints in particular. What else have we got? We've got the Management Partners Awards coming up, and we really wanted to recognize your leadership and your management excellence. And again, we've got about 2 or 3 weeks now to get your submissions in, so please think about that. Open until the end of February. Also, as you probably recall, each week we take the 5-minute slots from our experts, and we actually made them into 5-minute videos. We had over 800 people watch those set of videos last few weeks. Very powerful. And we've got over 80 of them in now. And those, as you can see, Nick, Suzanne, and Neil, who came along last week. And guess what? In a week's time, we will see Darshi, and we will also see Claire. So that's really great and interesting. So what are we doing now? Let's move on to the next section of today's, which is really about polls. And as we know from, well, the feedback from government is pretty clear. Your poll results are incredibly valuable in our analysis during these dynamic times. And in fact, it isn't just the government. The House of Lords used one of our polls in a report on the future UK-EU relationship around professional business services back in October. I don't think, unfortunately, government was listening, but that's another story. But our poll was, I think, the only one that wasn't government stats in the whole of that report. So what happened last week? Let's just run through last week, because this is really quite interesting. We wanted to know what's happening to the level of activity. And it's kind of interesting because back in February of last year, a year ago, the blue, in other words, the expansion was up into the 80s, and the red, in other words, the contraction was right down into single figures. Move forward to this February, they're in the same sort of place. But gosh, hasn't there been a bumpy ride in between? Let's look at it in terms of new work. The same sort of principle applies. In other words, the new work coming into the firm has again juggled around, but isn't really where it was. And then expanding the headcount. Look at the headcount here. Again, almost a very similar pattern. So what we got here is we've got a situation that we are able to see that things were pretty good back in a year ago, but now not so good. So what's that telling us? Well, obviously, an expansion could be up 1% or up 10%, but what are the actual numbers doing? And again, what you'll see here is that the level of dip in the firm's income over the next 12 months has been very much sort of, nearly half the firms were thinking it was going to be more than 30% dip, and now more than 60% of the firms saying no dip at all. That's the blue one. This is going to be too busy to see, but what it's really telling you is that the top priorities remain strategy, remain actually increasing operational efficiency and people. But again, really jumbled picture. We're looking at priorities, really two come out quite strongly. One is the poor economic outlook, and the other one is the whole issue to do with the financial health of the clients. And that's the green line. As you can see, that's come from nowhere and is really quite high throughout. And that wouldn't have been around a year ago. So what are the things that carry the weight in the partner discussions? Well, again, as we've seen month in, month out, it's all about finance, the top. And then the one that's come up, and this is really more Claire's space, marketing, has very much sort of come up. 1 month it was actually equal level pegging. So those two are the areas, and the others are all kind of somewhere else. In terms of where people are likely to be working from home, you can hardly see it. Right at the bottom, there is a line for the people who are working, where everybody's going to be back in the office. And then at the top are the ones where everyone's working from home, and in the middle is the middle, so to speak. What about changes to the office space requirements after the pandemic's eased? Hasn't really shifted, to be perfectly honest. I think we are definitely heading for a virtual workplace. I think that's my view, looking at it. And which of these statements are true for your firm? Again, it's probably hard to read, but the key point to me is not that any particular one is high, but all of them are up into the 50s, 60s, sometimes even 80%. And I'm told by Andrew Kakubadze, who's one of our board members, that no other sector gets its leadership as such, given quite such high scores. So, pat on the back for the leaders of the firms. I think that's really great. So what are we going to be doing today? Well, let's move on to today's poll. And what I'm going to be doing in today's poll is I'm going to be encouraging you to redo actually technically, because we did this poll in June, which was right in the BLM. And I was trying to find out, okay, what's happened? Has anything happened? Is the dial moved at all? So what's the current level of inclusiveness? Who's responsible for it? How often is it discussed at management meetings? To what extent are ideas that work adopted or adopted? Are the formal targets, sort of proxy metrics, if you like, rewards and sanctions, conduct that is unbecoming, what happens, and are external things like BLM really having much of an influence? Okay, you can all see this, but how would you describe the current level of inclusiveness? Sort of most people are in the middle. 5. This is not a 1 to 5, it's a 1 to 6 scale. It's a bit confusing. So this is slightly better than normal, I guess you could say. Who has current responsibility? And if you're not seeing it, you have to scroll. But who has currently responsibility for the inclusiveness agenda at your firm? Again, the answer there is very much the managing partner, and that's encouraging, I think. How often is inclusiveness discussed at management meetings? That, again, I would say is going to be mostly regularly. To what extent are inclusive ideas that work adopted normally? What about ones that don't work? Are they being dropped normally? Okay. In terms of formal targets, this was quite an interesting one. There's quite a few areas that people could be doing. It's a bit concerning for me that the top target only half of you are doing, which means that half of you aren't doing any of these targets. And I can't really see the big agenda moving materially if none of those targets, and some of them are down to a few percent. I won't go through the detail because you've obviously just been through them. But in terms then of what about rewards given for achieving these targets, 72% never. Now, I appreciate some of you aren't doing them, but again, I think in life, and we're not talking necessarily about money rewards here, we're talking about rewards. If you're not praising people for doing something important, guess what? It's unlikely to happen. And in terms of sanctions, 83% never. In other words, these kind of more aspirations, I think. And what's interesting from the women's movement, we had this from Sue Vinicum on one of these calls the other week. She said, look, you set targets and then you monitor them, and you're very, very tough on people who fail to achieve those targets. That's not the message I'm getting from today, which is a shame, but there we are. To what extent are sanctions given for conduct by senior management and partners that is not inclusive? Well, 30% of you is saying never. That's, again, I don't think anybody in a firm where that's the case will have much likelihood of having a genuinely inclusive agenda coming into operation. Just don't think that's plausible. And to what extent is are firms influenced by external? Well, sometimes 60%. So I think the message really coming back to me from that is that we could do a bit harder as a sector. I think there's some important areas that could be looked at in terms of inclusiveness, and it's an issue which government I know is very interested in us. But let's get our own act together before we go out and preach, I think is probably my message. So welcome, Darshi. Over to you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you and good morning, everyone, for joining on a Friday morning in the middle of a lockdown. My wish for today is really to spend the next 5 minutes, maybe to give you a very espresso short introduction of me, but then to just take us all 36,000 feet in the sky and really look at the world that we are in and these challenges we face as a global system, but then bring us back down to the ground and leave you with some reflections for the weekend. So I am Darshita Gillies. I was born and raised in Mumbai. I say my journey is from the bottom 1% to the top 1% for 100% of the planet. And what I mean by that is I have lived the life of the person we call the so-called bottom 1%, where we didn't have access to food some days. We lived in a very humble home. My parents don't speak English, and I have a long list of picturing what that life looks like. And then on the opposite spectrum, I've also lived the life of the private jets and being here and being there and being able, not having to question why I need anything in my life. And the question I sat with myself was, especially when we were in very dire straits in Mumbai, the question I asked myself was, how do I bring my family out of this situation? And I worked my way to get us there. The question I ask myself now is, what if the whole world is my family? And what if the challenges we face are something that we all need to collectively solve? And what can I do as a human being to enable us to solve these big challenges like climate change and inequalities and so on and so forth? So I think I would say my pursuit is really to look at the world as a whole ecosystem, and to invest and build solutions that really address our global issues and challenges. So let's zoom up 36,000 feet. And I love the idea you've said for us, Richard, which is inclusiveness and ethics. And if I just focus on that from a global perspective, what we're seeing in terms of governance is that we have global challenges like climate change, or if you say financial inequalities or biodiversity loss. And yet we are governed as nation states. So China produces for the whole world, and yet China gets penalized as a country for its carbon emissions. So these are the kind of challenges that we really need to get to the crux of if we really want to have some systemic solutions and we want to move the world towards a future that we want to see happen. The next thing I want to highlight, again as a global challenge, but something for us all to reflect on, is that we have these stakeholder, shareholder systems that don't necessarily speak to each other. And what we really need is purpose-aligned systems where we bring stewardship back to the core of our operating paradigm. And that makes us inclusive, and that makes us make decisions that benefit all stakeholders rather than a few stakeholders just because they have a say in how we direct our actions. So, and then zooming back down, I would say, what can we do? We have big challenges and it can be daunting. The way I anchor myself in my everyday life is I look at what am I doing? What choices am I making when I buy a product or don't buy a product or a service? So just bringing awareness to that process. Second, as a business leader, I'm not just responsible for myself, I'm also responsible for the organization and my teams. So I do care to look for how can I enable my teams to be more empowered and more aware of their decisions, and creating systems to bring some of those challenges to the decision-making table. And then finally, obviously, as a business, and especially many of us have service-led businesses, we don't have the same sort of carbon emissions when it comes to production and consumption. But as service-led businesses, many of us can start thinking about the human challenges that we can resolve. I love the poll we had today, which is the little things we can do in making our organizations more inclusive. Because I do feel that the more we bring diverse views at the table, the more the organization becomes stronger, and that strength becomes the DNA of the organization. There is we because we are inclusive, we reflect and can speak to a larger set of audiences and attract more clients than we would had we just been sort of a siloed or a monotone looking organization. I'll stop there. I'm happy to share more on any insights if anyone has questions.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Darshi. And your personal story to me is just inspirational. So we'll catch up more you shortly. But now I'd like to invite our second guest. And our second guest today is Claire Mason, who I mentioned earlier. She runs a business called Man Bites Dog. It's normally the other way around, so I'm sure she'll tell us what it's all about.
Thank you, Richard. Yes, I'm sure you've all heard, it's the definition of news. Dog bites man happens all the time. Man bites dog's a story. And that's really about an idea so remarkable it's worth sharing. And that's what we're all really about. We're a global thought leadership consultancy developing future thinking for intelligent brands like you guys to position you as leaders in the next economy. Which means we do a lot of global research for professional and financial services firms, regularly interviewing CEOs, customers, employees, and also investors who are members of our global investor community, the $50 trillion club. And what I really wanted to talk to you about today was sustainability and your role as professional business advisors in helping clients with their sustainable leadership. So all the research we do gives us some really unique insights into sustainability and our transition to the net zero economy, highlighting some challenges and also some exciting opportunities for professional business advisors. And what we're seeing in our research right now is that this sustainability agenda is gathering pace. I'm sure you notice it in the news every day and the topics that we're talking about. There's a real momentum behind it. But what's really important is that it's just about to reach a tipping point, after which change is going to move very quickly. So we all know 2030 is a key milestone. We've heard from Darshi about the real human importance that we meet the sustainable development goals that the UN have set by 2030. But also we need to think about halving our emissions by then and being on track to be net zero by 2050 or before. And within that framework, this year, 2021, is absolutely fundamental, not just because of COP26 later in the year and the new Biden administration's climate policies, but because this year is the year that multinational CEOs are putting their net zero transition strategies into action. So you will have noticed from the CEO speeches and investor sessions last year, they all set their plans out. This year is the year that we start to see some action, and I think that's very exciting. So the COVID context is also very relevant here. In some sectors, business has actually had quite a good crisis. It's proved a lot more resilient than many business leaders would have thought. Business has surprised itself by how well it has adapted to this massive change. And we've seen a real rise in the S of ESG, the social impact. So business has, to a large extent, looked after its employees and stepped up in ways from developing and rolling out vaccines to ensuring our food supplies. And for the first time in what seems like forever, public trust in business has actually gone up as business leaders have acted in good faith and in some places filled a leadership void left by governments. Leaders have also accepted something really fundamental, which is that business has a critical role to play in society. And business leaders have a newfound confidence in the ability of business to drive rapid change. So this is the year sustainability and ESG more broadly is going to go mainstream. And when it does, the domino effect of change is going to happen very quickly. There's a popular misconception that sustainability is only really relevant to FMCG brands who gain consumer preference from their environmental credentials. But this decarbonisation agenda will leave no sector untouched. Employees are obviously a key driver of change for all businesses, and investors are exerting influence as never before. But the dramatic lever that will start this domino effect is far less visible. It will be the net zero supply chain. So the scope 3 emissions in the supply chain are often the largest share of an organisation's carbon footprint. So they represent the biggest opportunity for impact. And they're also in some ways the easiest thing to reduce. You can simply mandate it and the direct costs to you are relatively low. So we're starting to see organisations mandate net zero supply chains now, and also to some extent wrap diversity and inclusion into that mandate, as we've seen recently with Coca-Cola. So if companies want to be part of a diverse net zero supply chain, they're going to have to clean up their act, and quickly. So what does all this context mean for you as professional business advisors? Well, to date, sustainability has remained relatively niche in professional services firms, the domain of those engaged in the energy sector or advising FMCG firms, climate risk specialists, or experts in responsible investment fund formation or corporate reporting. But soon, sustainability and that whole ESG and diversity and inclusion agenda will cut across absolutely everything that you do. So I wanted to very briefly highlight 4 opportunities for professional services leaders to consider. First, the size of the net zero challenge cannot be underestimated. The level of business transformation required, especially in carbon intensive sectors, and also in some of the emerging markets, this challenge is of a scale that will put recent decades of digital transformation in the shade. If we thought that level of change was difficult, we're facing something much bigger now. So how will your services support that organisational change for your clients? Secondly, the level of finance that's going to be required for transformation and innovation is going to be very significant, and it will require investors to take a much more nuanced view of negative screening if we're to support decarbonisation and net zero transition, rather than just pulling the plug on these industries. So how will you help companies raise finance, and how will you help investors balance opportunity, risk and responsibility? Third, the intensity of the spotlight on individual CEOs and leaders and the combined expectations of their employees, customers and investors are intensifying. And given that many companies' transitions will rely on these huge change programs and also technologies that haven't even been invented yet, the transition narrative, that story told by the CEO, is all investors really have to go on to decide who they think is going to successfully change and who won't. So markets are expecting an almost heroic level of leadership. How will you support those individual business leaders and help them navigate the future? And finally, we face an enormous talent crisis. Exponential growth in demand for these sustainability experts means that lack of talent could put the brakes on our progress. So what can you do to build sustainable capability in your team and transfer that knowledge to clients? We need to make this decade really count. So I would urge you all to consider your own sustainable leadership and how your firm can support clients in their net zero transition so we can all get there faster. Thank you.
Wow, that was great, Claire. Thank you very much for those thoughts. And as you say, it's a tough agenda. It will mean everybody has to do things very, very differently, which kind of brings me to Jeremy. Welcome back, Jeremy, and lovely to have you on the show again. For those who haven't been on the show with Jeremy, he's been on for getting on for 20 of them, I suspect. So fantastic sustainability there in itself. But more importantly, Jeremy, what do you think about this agenda in terms of your own firm? To what extent is sustainable creeping up the agenda locally?
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Claire and Darshita, for your very interesting and thought-provoking presentations. Certainly, it is on our agenda at Hayes McIntyre, and is increasingly moving up the agenda. I think it's one of those things that, you know, probably we all feel, and various leaders that I speak to, and I'm involved in a couple of groups of other managing partners from firms of our size and above and below, and we all have these discussions, and we all feel, you know, every time we talk about it, we all feel we should be doing a lot more. And we all come away from it feeling a little bit guilty that there's always more to do, and there's always more we should be looking at. And as much as we're progressing, and we go back to our own office and we work on it, and we think we're progressing well, but then you open your eyes, as Claire and Darshita have done again this morning, and you think, oh blimey, we could be doing a lot more. Interestingly, we are probably faced at the moment with a particular matter, and I won't divulge the details of it, which for the first time will involve significant discussion at partner level about a moral stroke ethical issue, which will have, you know, financial bearing on the business. But it's interesting. I think my first time as a partner at the firm, we've had something like this to discuss at partner level that is really, and you've got quite a division of views, and we have to be very mindful, obviously, of both client reactions and increasingly our staff reactions to decisions we take in this area. So that's a particular challenge we've got at the moment. It's interesting that this morning there's an article in the Financial Times, and for those accountants amongst you, you'll be aware that we're going to be going through a period of significant audit reform, and that article is specifically making reference to the record. It's about a white paper that's due out early next week. And it's making specific reference to new rules to report environmental and social obligations. So I think this is on us. We need to be doing more. I'd like to be doing more, but you know, we increasingly have to address these matters.
Thank you, Jeremy. And Francesca, obviously everyone knows Francesca, who's ever been on this show before, but where do you think people start on this sustainability journey? I'm sure across your 129 countries that you're active in as an organization, there must be some who are taking the lead and others who are possibly not putting it quite as high on the agenda as they might. I mean, where does it fit in your world?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge area, and it won't surprise you to see that globally there's some very different views around sort of the pace that things are going. But I think what really calls you up short is appreciating that we have a finite period of time to take action to really make a difference here. I think often within our network, there's sort of two areas. One is, what are you doing yourself? It's really hard to talk to clients about sustainability if you aren't doing things yourself, because the first question they should be asking you, well, what are you doing about it? So I think there's a really important piece about putting your own house in order, particularly if you are getting into the sustainability space. And that can range from everything through from recycling into deeper thinking about that zero impact to the world, which I really like, that sort of that concept, that desire. But then there's also perhaps something we haven't touched on today is sustainability as a service, which of course in professional services firms, there's a real opportunity to help businesses with their sustainability programs. And a lot of that is around actually verifying certain things, giving comfort around, are things really doing what you think they're doing? I think that's a massive growth area. But actually we and I'm sure lots of you have got, we've got experts in sustainability who help businesses in lots of different ways about how do they make this come alive for themselves and how do they make sure this really happens. So I think within the professional services sphere, there's these two very different things. There's one thing about how do we actually turn this into a viable service that actually gives value to clients? And then what do you do yourself to really show that you're truly committed to it?
Thanks very much. Darshita, just kind of poking back to you, if I may, and perhaps a little bit about what Manch does in terms of bringing together investors and philanthropists and helping along the people along the journey? Because I think a lot of people are not quite sure where to start almost.
Yeah, and I think, just to concur what everyone said so far, I think sustainability is a growing market opportunity. And a lot of organizations know inherently that what they're doing is fantastic, but how do they then start to articulate it to their stakeholders in a way that they can not just tell the nice story or the right thing, but also back it with data-driven systems. And that's what we do at Munch. Our aim is to really serve the impact ecosystem with digital solutions that bring the sector together. Two reasons why. One is because impact is not something that's done in isolation. It's done by us as different stakeholders. To give an example, an investor invests in a company. The company may grow and then have its own foundation. The foundation invests in a charity. The charity supports a community. And each of them will say, oh, we made a difference in 1 million lives. And we end up thinking, oh, wow, 4 million lives have been transformed. But the reality is only 1 million lives have been transformed. And 4 stakeholders came together to deliver that single unit of impact. And that's what we are working towards from a technology perspective, is how do we streamline the impact narratives and the impact databases so that we can actually see what difference is being made and where the gaps are. And that enables us then to have the intelligence to channel resources where they matter most. And then more precisely to the organizations themselves, there is never, what we have seen is there isn't a budget holder for impact or sustainability. This role has been carved out of different people's roles. And then there's someone whose role it's not to join it all up together and put the organization's impact in one place. And what we recognize is that that impact in itself will not be a business role. Yet all businesses will need to account for impact. So for professional services organizations, it's generally quite hard to find who is the stakeholder we need to be talking to get the ownership or buy-in from the organization to really bring that solution to life, whether it's a service or whether it's a technology solution, or even if it's a product. So what we have focused on as an organization is to look at how do we bring efficiency to this process, which is generally quite messy and uncoordinated. There are Excel sheets and documents and systems that are not joined up, and yet all these systems have incredible data and stories and inspirations to bring organizations together and showcase and demonstrate that impact. And why organizations need that now ever more is because investors are looking. They are making decisions based on how these organizations perform. So if you want to be an organization that wants to attract capital, this is an important reason why organizations really need to invest in services. And I think there will be an interim challenge, at least this year, in finding the right stakeholders. And just to end on that, at Munch, what we and the way we approach organizations we work with is generally we try for the first meeting, bring the right stakeholders, all of them at the table for once, to share how impact is really going to impact each of their business divisions. Because in the end, we don't know who will say yes to it or no to it, but to have them all from the word go and getting their collective buy-in is key. Because then even if you're working with one stakeholder within the business, everyone knows the purpose behind why someone's working with us.
Thanks, Darshita. That was a really interesting idea of bringing everybody together. There's a couple of words I took out of that. One was this whole idea of, we did the poll, and if you recall, the CEO was responsible for inclusiveness. And yet further down the scorecard, I don't think they would have been very proud of the scores. There is an issue there when you can say, yeah, the CEO is responsible for everything, which is at one level true, but it doesn't actually get you very far. So thank you for sharing that. The other word you used to was articulation, which kind of takes me, I think, nicely into Claire, because a lot of what Claire is doing is trying to articulate those messages in a way that resonate with the key audiences. Do you want to explore a bit more on that dimension, please, Claire?
Sure. So I think for professional and financial services firms, your actual footprint is very low. So what you need to do is not rely on offset and try and reduce that through behavioural change. So the opportunity, as Francesca highlighted, is sustainability as a service, which is both a business growth opportunity for you and an opportunity to be really purposeful in how you grow your businesses and the work that your employees are doing to really help clients make that journey to net zero, some of those clients in those more carbon intensive sectors. So I think the story you articulate is incredibly important in terms of putting a flag up for how you can help and what you see as your role. So a lot of what we do is large thought leadership campaigns that enable you to highlight a problem in the market which you're well placed to solve and highlight opportunities for clients. So for example, we've done a really interesting recent campaign in partnership with Standard Chartered Bank, where we looked at highlighting how could we get more investment to where it's needed most, as in to contribute to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So we actually market sized and highlighted that there was a $10 trillion private sector investment opportunity in those Sustainable Development Goals. And we looked at specific goals like clean energy, water, transport infrastructure, digitization by market, so they could see exactly where those opportunities were. So that was a great opportunity to highlight the incredible sustainable capability and sustainable finance team that Standard Chartered Bank has. But it was also about using their marketing budget for good. So we generated tremendous benefit from that marketing budget in terms of supporting the UN, directing capital to where it was needed, and providing the local development banks with very specific data on how much investment they needed to actually reach the goals. So it's really interesting to also challenge your marketing budget and say, you know, can we do well by doing good? Can we really raise our profile and be thought leaders, but actually really make a difference? And I think we've really started to measure what we're doing differently, because before we would have measured reputation, relationships and revenue generated by our campaigns, but now we will also look at real world impact as well, which I think is something all of our clients are really passionate about and their employees are really passionate about. And I think that thinking about it's almost looking at the landscape and trying not to be all things to all people, but working out for your particular firm, what's the thing that you can own, where's your authority, what can you champion, and really build a platform around that will point at your services, but also really do good in the world as well, because all of you are going to have a much greater impact by helping clients than you are with your own direct footprint.
Fantastic. Jeremy, a couple of things. You mentioned the FT article over the reform of the audit profession, which again is something that has been, I think we're kind of waiting for, because it was been, some of those reports go back a few years now, but I think the new Secretary of State has kind of seen that as one of his things he wants to get on with. I was on the council call with him yesterday, and he was talking about the importance of sustainability and running up to COP26. So I think there's a lot for the professional services firms to do in that area. But the one area that did come out of that report and that article in the FT was this whole issue of auditing ESG, you could call it. In other words, where professional firms, auditors in particular, are using their attest function, can actually then give comfort not just to the organization, but more importantly to their investors, that actually when they say that they are achieving this, we're not in Darshita's situation where everybody grabs the credit, so 1 million suddenly becomes 4. Do you want to give some idea? Do you see that as a service that your firm might be offering in the future?
I think it's interesting, and this whole piece around sustainability as a service is probably a hurdle that we as a business, and I suspect a lot of professional services firms, need to try and get over, because at the moment, and I'm slightly embarrassed to say it, but there's a lot of these things are seen as an overhead, and we are building on these overheads and not viewing them as a service. And I think we have to start thinking about that. Of course, that is, and I speak as a chartered accountant, that is difficult sometimes for accountants and lawyers to get their heads around, looking at services that, you know, they've never dealt with, they've never been trained in, etc., etc. But I think it's certainly something that we will be thinking about. I have to say, there's probably other areas of priority in terms of services that we're looking to expand and develop for clients, but maybe that's wrong. We probably need to move this further up the agenda. At the moment, where we have clients that need any sort of reporting like this, it's outsourced to a specialist provider. Now, are we of a size? Can we afford to invest and make inroads such that we can be providing this service? Probably, provided we look at it, and I think it was Claire that said, also as a marketing piece, so that it's something to build our own offer for our clients in that, or to attract new clients, then possibly we can. But I suspect we are at a size that is we're the smallest you could probably go before you could probably, and we're a 37 partners, 300 people business. I suspect firms smaller than ours would feel that it's not really a market that they can get into, rightly or wrongly. I don't know.
I'd love to come in on that if that's possible, Richard. Would that be okay? So Jeremy, I think that you raised something really interesting, which is kind of if you were to help with corporate reporting in any way, the efficiency of a business your size being able to do that, but also for small businesses in the supply chain who want to be part of that net zero supply chain. They might not be able to afford ISO certifications or the sort of corporate reporting you're talking about. They're not PLCs. So there probably is a market for something much more efficient that as a smaller firm you could offer smaller firms. I think there's a huge opportunity there, because all of these small businesses want to be certified net zero, because big companies want to have small businesses and diverse owned businesses, etc., in their supply chain. So there's probably a huge market there. But just to come back to your point on corporate reporting, it's so important that we're comparing apples and apples, and that we have consistent reporting standards. The lack of consistent reporting standards is a barrier to capital being invested in the right places at the moment. But also we need to be really careful with that, because it could be a really blunt instrument. So I think the UN Principles of Responsible Investment Group, the UNPRI, have done some really interesting work. But if we go down the route of ESG ratings, and this leads to excluding certain assets from portfolios, this could be a huge problem, because what does that mean about sustainable development in the developing world? You know, what does it mean for companies that need capital now to finance this enormous transition? So actually these sort of using a ratings to purely exclude carbon intensive industries is not really going to help us get there faster. It's much more nuanced. So we need to be really careful not to use it as a blunt instrument, I think.
Well, it's a little bit like this situation in Whitehaven at the moment, where there's a new coal mine, and the argument government put forward is very simple. Well, otherwise it would be shipped from Australia, and quite frankly, there is less carbon footprint involved if it's mined locally, but this coal is needed for certain power stations. So, you know, I think, again, there's often a complex range of issues. I won't go into that space. That's the government's angle, I know. But what I would like to do is just ask Francesca, if I may. We've kind of covered a lot here in terms of sustainability. We haven't really picked up some of the points from the survey. It seems like 3 years ago we did that survey. It's only 30 minutes, but that's what happens on this show. Time seems to go really, really slowly and really fast at the same time. It's quite amusing. Do you have any kind of thoughts on that survey? I know we did it sort of back in June of last year, and I don't think I've seen much change between then and now. Is that reasonable, or do you think people, the BLM movement, should have brought about a bigger change?
Well, I know that in previous sessions we've talked about how long behavioural change can take, and the difficulty of actually seeing change happen with some speed and agility, particularly in difficult areas like inclusion. So yeah, I've got a few thoughts to do on that. I'm just going to make one thought that was around that impact review piece that Darshita mentioned as well. I just want to say, we did our first global impact review last year. What a fantastic exercise that was for us. I mean, yeah, it's nice to be able to be transparent and put information out there and let people see what we're doing. But what was really helpful was how we had to really challenge ourselves to say, actually, what are we really doing? Are we doing everything we could? So just sort of putting out there the value of doing it really, really tests you in terms of what truly are you doing in this space and what are you offering in this space as well. But on the inclusivity point, one of my favourite topics, as you know, Richard, I'm just going to pick up on the the ethnicity part of that, because obviously getting data around gender has actually become a lot easier. It's often something that businesses report on. You can get that data more easily. It's really hard to get ethnicity data, mainly because it's just not being collected in the same way or consistently over the years. And I think smart-minded businesses are really, really waking up to the fact that probably, just like gender has been an issue for many, many years, that actually, unless you take intentional action, things don't just change on their own, because this is about behavioral change, and often quite subtle behavioral change, where it isn't always really obvious what it is that's stopping you being a more inclusive environment. And I know our UK firm's just done a really fantastic piece of work with an external organisation as well. And one of the things that just came through was inconsistent action around inclusivity, even within an organisation. You might have some very good high-level principles that you're going to follow, and everyone says that's, why wouldn't you? But it's the micro stuff that makes all the difference. Micro positive encouragement, micro negative things that happen, real recruitment within the organisation, a really intentional focus. And those of us who've been banging the drum about gender for decades knows that it's only when you get really intentional and actually make some very specific changes, reward people who do the right things, and also penalize the people who do the wrong things, that you really begin to drive change. And I mean, I've been really encouraged about the volume of discussion that's really gone up around this particular issue, but we've got a long way to go, and there's real behavioral pieces there. And one of the things that kind of breaks your heart is people talking about being an outsider within, going, I sit within an organization, but I still feel like a bit of an outsider because either the color of my skin or some other element that doesn't make me feel like I truly belong. I can't feel I can be truly myself. And I think for all of us, that's the challenge of really embracing inclusivity. And there's just a hard-nosed commercial fact that the more inclusive you are, the more diverse you're thinking, the more you tend to be, the more successful you become. But just from a humanity point of view, who wants to be an organization that excludes some of its people? So I think there's a long way to go on really driving out what will be the levers of change. But I think it is all about intentional consistency around approach.
Darshita, do you have any thoughts on that? We've got a few minutes left now, just sort of in terms of that agenda. It can be one that for some people is a bit sensitive, but clearly you or somebody will always be in that BAME grouping if people do those stats.
I'll say, I think we sometimes look at inclusivity and diversity and inclusion, and even in organization, in a very black and white tick box way, which I have found very challenging. And for me, it's the age box that I don't tick. I don't tick the experience box. And so I never get invited to any board tables if I follow the normal recruitment channels. The board positions I hold are purely because I have met people on flights and they've spoken to me for 8 hours and they've gone, I want you at the board. I know that you add value. So I think there is a need for especially senior managers and those of us who advise businesses to really look at HR practices and give very different mandate to the recruitment agents to bring a different lens to how they bring talent to the organization. And then, just from being at the table, I know that bringing someone like me it's not just bringing someone of a different color or different gender. It's really requiring of the organization also to empower and give voice to people who bring diverse. And most of the times in organizations I've seen where anything is being challenged, the person, whether it's a man or a woman, color or white, they are put to the side because organizations are resistant to change. And what we really need now is to, at least at the boardroom level, have a honest discussion about where our vested interests are keeping us stuck. And having those bold discussions, I feel, is missing in the boardrooms, especially.
Yeah, and then the other challenge, of course, is that the boardroom can have a great conversation. A plan is written, nobody reads it, and nothing changes. So how do you actually cascade that down the organization? I think the proxy metrics that were in that survey are very important, because the truth is it will take a long time for the dial to move at the very senior level. But actually what matters is that people at all levels have something they can celebrate because a target has been achieved. And I think that's very much part of it as well. Jeremy, one thing that I was just picking up on quickly was, and Francesca mentioned it, was working with an external. Darshita's bringing a whole group of people together. So do you think there's an opportunity there for you maybe to partner with some of these specialists that you've been working with up to now and actually bring your dimension, even if they possibly remain the gurus in certain areas?
Absolutely, Richard. Sorry, I must dash in a minute. I have to leave for another call. But yeah, absolutely. And I think there are a lot of these areas where increasingly professional firms will work in collaboration with other providers. And we're starting to see that in other areas. So absolutely, I think that will be the case.
Thanks very much. And Jeremy, I know you have to leave now, but anyway, we've only got about 2 minutes left. So Francesca, do you have any kind of wrap-up thoughts for today?
Well, gosh, we've covered a really broad range as always, Richard. And I think there was two really strong themes that came through. I mean, the sustainability for ourselves and sustainability as a service, and then the whole piece around the different elements of behavioral change that are really needed in order to get inclusivity as a real part of businesses. And I think it takes you back to these are all complex areas. None of these are easy changes, but they are about behavior, and they are about your senior leadership, not just saying things, but truly buying into them and making intentional change. And I think they're also about people really embracing the value of doing it, because if anything of the last few months has taught us is if we really focus on how to get our businesses in a good place, we can do extraordinary things. So my biggest takeaway is that you have to take action, and that action has to be done from a place of knowledge and understanding, and really be open to a strong challenge. Because just because we've always done things in a certain way doesn't mean it's the perfect way. So I took a lot away from those conversations around the action that's needed and the information you need to take that appropriate action.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much there. And unfortunately, that means it's kind of the end of the show, which is a bit sad. But just to say that the recordings will be up in the Management Library shortly. And I think it only then remains for me to say that I hope you found today valuable, and please encourage your peers to book for future episodes of the show. It's always the same link. And back next Friday. Next Friday, we have Kim Tasso, that some of you will know, marketing and also psychologist, wrote lots of books. Luke Bardin talking about strategic partnering, which is a whole new area. And James Falconbridge, who is a Deputy Dean of the Lancaster University Management School, talking about some of his special area of interest. And if you recall, he is one of the key people on the team which put together the report, which we are presenting on the 17th of March at the Fast Track Innovation Summit. So please sign up for that as well. Only remains for me to say thank you very much to the amazing panel that we've had today. Just bring everybody into the site. And Jeremy is sadly gone, obviously. Thank you all very much, and look forward to being back next week with a new set of guests. Bye for now.